Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. And our guest today is David Hackett Fischer. David, it's great to see you. David, it's great to see you. And David Fischer is the author of 13 books. He is the university professor and Warren Professor of History Emeritus at Brandeis. His books include Paul Revere's Ride, Washington's Crossing, for which he received the Pulitzer Prize, Champlain's Dream. I mean, we could go on with the books you've written, but the one we're here to talk about today is your most recent one, which is African Founders, How Enslaved People Expanded American Ideal. So, David, it's great to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here. I should say my wife, Judy, is the brain of the operation, and she says that her next husband will have to be illiterate.
Now, you and Judy have been partners in much of this, and you and she visited.
We have, yes. She's a biologist, has her own. After she raised a family, she got a doctorate in biology and joined the faculty of MIT, and she's been very active that way. She's also on the faculty of the Radcliffe Harvard Pottery Studio and does many other things. She's a professional flutist and
Wow.
as well as a biologist and many other things. So
I was going to say she must make your accomplishments pale because she.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And you and she have visited Africa several times.
Yes, we do. We have quite a number of times. I've always worked on the rule that the first rule of writing history is go there, and visit the place and get to know it. And we've tried to do that with everything I've ever done, and we particularly enjoyed doing that in Africa, going mostly between our terms. When I'm not teaching, which would mean we'd be going in January or so, our January, which would be it turned out to be a very good time to visit sub-Saharan Africa, and we went to most of the countries that the book is about, and always tried to get away from the universities to get into the countryside, working with young Africans who were in history programs, and they were our guides, our translators, and our teachers through much of this. And we hugely enjoyed getting to know African people in their own communities, and it was a wonderful experience. Always, it was traveling. My wife and I traveling together, Judy and I.
Mm-hmm. And so, how does going there?
How did we?
You don't know how it would have changed what you've written because it's.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you. You said, "How did we go there?"
How did going to Africa and actually how does going there and actually seeing the places change the way you think about the people?
The main part of it was to meet people in their own communities and to get to know them that way. We were overwhelmed by their friendship. They welcomed us, and we hugely enjoyed that opportunity to get to know them. They were our teachers,
right?
And
that's great.
We learned much more than we could have from library work here in this country.
Okay, so the first rule is go there. What's the second rule for writing history?
Second rule is do it. And the third is write it.
Okay.
Those are my three rules.
So what do you mean by do it?
I mean actually trying to experience what we're studying, getting to know them in the course of their daily work, sharing it wherever we can,
right,
and learning it that way.
Right. Now, it's a great book, African Founders, and it does look regionally at both the places in Africa from which people came and the places in in the American colonies where they went. So some of the what are some of the things that people from Africa brought with them when they came as part of the transatlantic slave trade? They come from different areas in Africa, so they come not necessarily as Africans, but as Akan or Wolof or Angolans. What are some of the folkways, foods, traditions that they bring with them?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all they brought a language. They brought a worldview. Many of them were they were very different religions. Some of them were Islamic. Others practiced various Christian faiths. Others have African faiths. Some more than one faith. And their religions were, in most cases, profoundly important to them. But I thought they to try to learn a little bit more about their languages, their ways of thinking about the world. Was what we were trying to do, and they brought all of these things with them to America, and these cultures that they were raised in Africa were not stripped away from them. They have persisted and entered into the very mixed cultural world of America, and added that layer to the European cultures and the American Indian cultures. And then later Oriental Chinese cultures and so forth that have all mixed and greatly enriched the cultural life of this great republic.
One point you make in the book is that many Africans brought with them a facility for language and were served as translators, because they had experience with different languages in Africa, and thus were able to move between and develop languages in the New World.
Yes, really. These were mainly oral languages, and they were extraordinarily expressive. And we have seen the ways in which they have entered into American life. There are regional patterns in this country. That one of the most interesting patterns, I think, is what we find in South Carolina, where there were three waves from Africa, and the first and the third waves drew very heavily from Angola. Angola, broadly conceived, included much of the southern parts of Congo, and the languages of that region were carried and put to work in South Carolina, where they became the dialect that's called Gullah, which comes from Angola. In South Carolina, and the Gullah culture is really quite extraordinary. And we met and mixed with people there, traveling with our good friend Charles Joyner, who was very much a part of that culture. He was himself of European origin, but he steeped in that Angolan culture, and we spent a lot of time with him. He did major work of his own. On the history of Angolans in America, and we learned much from. Everybody calls him Chaz, from Chaz Joyner. And he was a wonderful colleague and a friend, and he passed away now, and we greatly miss him. But he's very much alive in my world today, still as a presence. Yeah.
As historians, we do keep alive our friends, colleagues, and those we've studied. Yes. We're talking with David Hackett Fischer, author most recently of African Founders: How Enslaved People expanded American ideals. And you have your book broken into geographic sections. So New
Yes.
England, the Hudson Valley, the Delaware Valley, the Chesapeake, South Carolina, Louisiana, and then the interior. And I'm wondering if we could go through the regions, or you could tell us what stands out about each of these places, because each does have somewhat of a different history, and different people come to different areas
Yeah.
at different times.
Well, they were all these areas were very mixed.
Mm-hmm.
The major most of the major cultures in Africa, people came from most of the major African regions
Mm-hmm.
of the slave trading regions, to each of these American regions, but the proportions tended to be very different from one to another, and
Mm-hmm.
so the New England pattern drew much more heavily from West Africa. And we could go region by region. The patterns are never twice the same.
Mm-hmm.
Wherever they settled, they met a distinctive mix of European cultures as
Mm-hmm.
well. And there are also American Indian cultures that got
Right.
mixed up in all of this as well. So there was a these were very diverse cultures which developed their own character in each of these American
Mm-hmm.
regions. Mainly, I'm working with New England as a region,
Right.
for these purposes, and then the Hudson Valley, and then
Mm-hmm.
the Delaware Valley, which
Mm-hmm.
meant to both West Jersey and Pennsylvania and
Yes.
parts of Delaware, and
Right.
then the Chesapeake
Mm-hmm.
area, which was Maryland and Virginia, and then it was the Carolinas. So, and the last one was Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the cultures I
Yes.
mainly worked for.
And within these, I mean, you really are a master at giving us these broad themes in a really compelling way, but also then finding individuals who are part of the story,
Yeah.
like James Fortin and then his sister, I believe, or his aunt, Fortune.
Yes. Yes.
And
Always trying to tell stories,
yes,
and to listen to the storytellers,
right.
and to learn from them in
Mm-hmm.
all of these different regions. It's the incredible the riches of American culture is to be found in its regional diversity, and
Mm-hmm.
within each of these regions, a different mix of cultures, with some predominating, but
Mm-hmm.
many participating in interesting ways. So it makes an extraordinary and highly creative sort of a of a history that
Yes,
is what American history is.
it is.
That's
Now,
what these are drivers of American history, I think.
right. And you're writing about this extraordinary brutality of slavery and the
Yeah.
slave trade.
Yes,
It's
I tried to bring out that as clearly as I could. Very brutal,
mm-hmm.
brutal at the beginning, brutal all the way through, brutal in physical terms, but there was another kind of mental and emotional brutality about it as well, which was very much a part of that story, and yet the human spirit survived that.
Mm-hmm.
It was not destroyed by that process. And I'm celebrating that spirit that emerged from that horrific experience. I don't mean to be celebrating the horror itself, but of the humanity
Mm-hmm.
that survived and even flourished
Mm.
in the presence of these horrors
Mm.
that were part of slavery.
It is.
So
It's
it's an
such
amazing
an extra.
story, really.
It really is. It really is. And
Yeah.
so you seem optimistic as you're writing about this tremendous brutality. The human spirit survives,
Yes.
and so there is
I
this.
think that's very much in the American grain. I always, I think I'm just naturally, I think most Americans are naturally optimistic
Mhm.
about things. However, miserable the circumstances may be at the
Right.
moment, we not only hope, but we expect that they will get better,
Hmm.
and that it's our duty to make them so. We also are instrumental in the way that we think about these things. Americans think that we can make a difference in the world,
Hmm.
and we work at that. And sometimes we make a difference in the way that we meant to, and sometimes in other ways. But all of that is what this country is all about. It's the source of the incredible creativity of this culture, and
Hmm.
also of its dynamism, which is so much a part of it. And it's as strong today as ever it was. People who despair about America don't have a clue about that. And it's I think I think this culture is as strong and as creative today as it has ever been in the past, and it's also creative in many different ways, from one end of the country to another. So
Thank you.
that's
We're talking with David Hackett Fischer, author of a dozen plus books. The most recent is African Founders: How Enslaved People Expanded American Ideals. And that's really a critical thing, because in each section of the book, you talk about how people brought as slaves or descended of people brought from Africa expand and the notion of what is America. And people like Frederick Douglass, or I mentioned James Forten, or Bishop Allen, Absalom Jones, who's on the cover, Sojourner Truth. I mean, it really is the story of these folks.
yeah.
And
What's amazing to me is how very diverse we are, and yet how in the expansion of this diversity, we have found a kind of unity. That's our national motto, "A
right.
pluribus unum." From
Hmm.
all of these differences, we have become one,
Hmm.
and I think that's a paradox. A paradox is, I
It
think,
is.
officially defined as a seeming contradiction. That is to say,
Yes.
it's not really a contradiction, although it's a tension within it that's very strong and often very creative, and that's what I try to write about in very specific ways, in ways in which
Hmm.
these cultures have.
Hmm.
We're talking now about African cultures, but I've written other books about European cultures,
Right.
and it was a similar process, though different in substance, and then the interplay of all of that. I'd like to write, if the Lord spares me, I'd like to write another book about the diversity of American Indian cultures,
Okay.
to add yet a third layer
Hmm.
of all this,
Yes.
and
Yeah. Yes.
and just and
That,
always to celebrate it.
right.
Something has gone profoundly right in this
Hmm.
process, and that's what I want to bring home to people. And I'm also very optimistic for the American future. And I think that our children and grandchildren, and we're beginning to think about great grandchildren now,
Hmm.
are I think will continue to help this culture evolve in new ways and in more creative ways, from one generation to the next. So
That's great. Now, you've written about, well, you mentioned Albion Seed and Champlain Stream, about these different cultures. Do you think it's kind of a two-part question? Does this mix of cultures make America exceptional or unique? And do you believe in American exceptionalism? But I think a phrase that has it's somewhat fraught with meaning and interpretation.
I
Is
missed
this
the last part of what you just said. You think that uh, your last thought? Can you repeat
so? Are you is this something that makes America unique or exceptional?
I think it is. I think every country is unique, and there's a particular intensity of that, given the extraordinary heterogeneity
Hmm.
of the American system, by comparison with others. But I don't. I think other countries have a similar dynamism, as a dynamic. And
Hmm.
the Chinese story is a case in point. It's very creative, and
Hmm.
with many different Chinese cultures that have mixed without ever quite merging, but with the same sort of creativity there, as it also is in Western Europe and in Africa itself. I don't think America is unique in all of this, though the result is never twice the same. So
Right.
but the processes are comparable, if not
Hmm.
identical. Never identical, but comparable and interesting that way.
Hmm.
So
Right.
that's what keeps me going with. And I think of myself increasingly as a cultural historian.
Mm.
I am called that now, and it's the diversity of these cultures, but most of all of the people who are the carriers of these
Hmm.
cultures, and not just carrying them, but changing them and recreating them in some way as
Right.
they learn them and then put them to work and then pass them on to the next generation. And in that process, the cultures continue to evolve, become
Hmm.
something a little different in every generation,
Yes.
and creative in that process.
Hmm. Yeah, and you're talking about, children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, the idea that we are transmitting this. This is
Yeah,
also something very much on the minds of the people we call the founders of the American Republic, that
yeah.
is transmitting something to posterity. So I am wondering if you see that. You've given us advice for historians. Should that be something we are at the work of doing, that is transmitting the idea of freedom, these ideas of this cultural pluralism to future generations? I mean, what should our goal be as historians?
I think absolutely so, and it's also to learn that if we're talking about liberty and freedom, we can see that, and I've written explicitly about
Yes.
this, that we can see
You have a
many
great
different
book,
ideas
Liberty and
of
Freedom.
liberty and freedom in America,
Yeah.
and there have been ideas that have become in some ways regionally predominant. In
Hmm.
New England, I think there are very different ideas of liberty and freedom in New England. From, let's say, on what Turner called the frontier, um, what others call the backcountry, but
Right.
however we think about it, that was another place where many different cultures met without ever entirely merging together, but continuing that ferment. And it happened. And my books are about the regional patterns of that mixing and merging. Um,
Hmm.
Everywhere the mixtures occurred, but never twice with the same ingredients or
Right.
with the same results.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
was diversity compounded on itself.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, we are all American. And so there's a kind of unity in that process as well, as we
Hmm.
all have undergone it in some way. And we
Hmm.
accept that frame, which becomes central to our own identity.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. So we're talking with David Hackett Fischer, author most recently of African Founders. Now, um, you grew up in a certain part of the country and how has Maryland, your place where you spent your formative years, influenced your outlook on history,
I
on
think
America? Like,
I think profoundly so,
yeah.
as I believe it does for almost everybody in different ways. But
Hmm.
Maryland is everybody agrees that Maryland is a border state.
Hmm.
And it's a place where different regional cultures meet without entirely merging into one. And to be a Marylander is to have elements of both a kind of a middle state culture, and then at the same time a sort of upper South culture mixing together. And then I married a Yankee, part of her family was from New England, back to the beginning, and part of it was from Minnesota, and so that brought another mixture. Her mixture was a little
Hmm.
different from, very profoundly different from my mixture, and
Hmm.
then our children were a mix of mixtures,
Hmm.
and the grandchildren are mixed in a third degree.
Hmm.
So, and I think that's the way America works. It's been going on like that for 15, 16 generations, depending on
Right.
how you count, and that's the source, I think, of our of that's a source of strength in this country.
Hmm.
And some people would tend to think of it as weakness, but I don't see
Hmm.
that at all. I think it's quite the reverse. So it creates it allows a possibility for more creativity, I think,
Hmm.
by this mixing. I think that's a key to what goes on here.
I, I think you're right. Now, many years ago, when you and I started our work as historians, we didn't have a book like this that really gives this story. So, how does having the story of the African founders, of the African presence, change the way we should look at early American history?
Well, I think it just it extends its reach, and I think Africans contributed much to American culture. If one can, the result of all these other cultures, I think that it brought we I think most people are aware of the linguistic creativity of African American culture,
Hmm.
which has become very much a part of American speechways. And as it was with that, it was also profoundly the case. Let's say, take another example would be American music,
Hmm.
in which the same sorts of mixing and merging happened. And we can see that Africans there played a major role in the development of American music, which I think almost everybody would recognize today in so many of the broad sort of genres of American music, jazz as one example of many others, and as it is with music, so it is with many other aspects of culture as well.
Hmm.
With music, it becomes more accessible and more visible and more teachable, and but it's the same in language. It's the same in other aspects of culture as well.
Hmm. And then American culture too has been transmitted across the world. You have an anecdote in your concluding chapter about a street demonstration in Ghana where people are burning the American flag, but they're also wearing T-shirts with names of
Yes,
American
that's right.
teams. And uh,
Yes, yes. I think that's an extraordinary a paradox. A paradox as defined as a seeming contradiction, more than
mhm,
seeming.
yes,
And I think it's the tension of these contradictions that has a kind of creative power to it,
mhm,
that leads to creativity in many ways. So,
mhm.
and-
Yes, yes. Frederick Douglass said a quote about it, where there's no struggle, there is no progress. And you
yes,
see in these contradictions, these paradoxes, the things that make us creative or
yeah,
push us in new
yeah.
ways.
And I would think that struggle picks what's up one side of that, but when the cultures mix, there are other things that are going on there, other than struggle. One
Hmm.
thing that's going on is creativity. One can borrow from one culture to solve the problems that appear in another, and so forth and
Hmm.
so on. And I think that's what makes this culture. That's what makes this culture very dynamic. I think that,
Hmm.
and I shouldn't say, I think America's not unique in this.
Hmm.
I think most cultures are like this in one way or another. I think it's particularly dramatic in America because of there have been so many other things mixing together here, more than in some other places. But there's a similar process almost everywhere, but never
Hmm.
twice in the same way. And
Hmm.
I think that's what makes cultural history so interesting
Hmm.
and so creative.
It
That we
is.
see
Yes.
what we're studying is so creative.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What first drew you to studying history?
Well, I don't know. I think it was partly a matter of time and partly a matter of place. I was born in 1935. My early years were in the Great Depression, of which I have very little memory of those early years. But then in my the critical years for, for me were the period that followed that, in which were in my teens and early adulthood,
Hmm.
and that ranged through the time of World War II, at which I had just turned 6 in 1941, just in the week of Pearl Harbor,
Hmm.
and then so that from 6 to 11 were the years of World War II, and every man of military age in my family. It's a big family, but
Hmm.
everyone, I think, with maybe only one or two exceptions, put on a uniform and served in every branch of service. As I think something similar happened in many families,
Hmm.
and they all survived. Some badly wounded. One was a prisoner of the Japanese for 4 years, but survived. And they all, I think, were changed profoundly by it,
Hmm.
and then had a career after the war. Often, I think, very creative in very creative ways and the
Hmm.
creativity flows from the experience of the war itself and from the many different experiences and that went on in those years. So then. Then so I could go on to other periods after that, but those were formative. That was a
Hmm.
formative period for me. There was another formative period that followed the war years, and into from that period on into the 1960s, and when I was in my early years of adulthood, and
Hmm.
that was a very creative time for this country as well.
Mm. It
All
was.
very challenging and difficult for
Yeah.
people, but also very creative.
Yes.
And each the series, the other periods that are following that is the period I can understand at least is the one that we're presently in right now. I think that's
Hmm.
always the case because we
Right.
don't have the perspective yet on what can begin to give us a sense of its shape and so forth.
Right.
But
Right. Now,
again, go ahead.
during that time of great ferment, the 1960s, you were writing your first book, which was
Yes.
on the revolution of American conservatism, I believe.
Yes, I
And
apologize for the title of that book. It was first called Federalist and Democracy, and a well-meaning publisher said that the book would sell better if you could have the themes of revolution in America and conservatism in the title. And I've been embarrassed by that title ever since because it's so heavy. Federalist and Democracy was what it was first called, and what is it really? It really is. It's about. It's about
mhm,
two generations of Federalists
right.
who lived through a period of revolutionary change and how they responded to that. I
Hmm.
think very creatively. We've had
Hmm.
much more on the creativity of the Jeffersonians and the Jacksonians. But the people who were in first the Federalists and then later the Whigs were also creative in their own ways. And what I was writing was about that process.
Right. They weren't simply standing athwart the world saying stop. They were
Right.
actually engaged with.
Yeah.
You mentioned the revolution they were all part of, and then
Yes,
they
that's right.
disagree with some of the ways it's going in the Jefferson
Right.
Jackson years.
It was also about the way in which the people who were on the conservative side of things. I think I'm more on the liberal side, but people who were
Hmm.
on the conservative side were often very creative in what they were doing.
Hmm.
And it's about some of that creativity in these I found generational patterns there. There were the older Federalists, and then the younger Federalists who came of age, came into politics often after the Revolution of 1800,
Hmm.
when the Federalists were driven out of office and had to reinvent themselves in a democratizing world, a world where people where the suffrage was greatly expanding very rapidly,
Hmm.
and other things were changing. I think the pace of change was accelerating. They had
Yes.
to adapt to all of that,
Mhm.
and and did by becoming creative themselves, even as they continued to be conservative, which I thought was an interesting paradox.
It is. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
No reason to apologize for the title. Well, the title wasn't your idea, but I'm wondering about your book, Historians' Fallacies, if that made
Yes.
you many friends in the academy.
Yes. Well, that was I'd always had an interest in history and in philosophy, and within philosophy, I was also interested in epistemology. That is, not
Hmm.
merely in, let's say, in moral philosophy and the philosophy of large ideas, but in the philosophy of how we learn and know about things, the process of learning and knowing. And so all of that has always been very interesting to me. I majored in history as an undergraduate at Princeton, but I had a minor in philosophy, or
Hmm.
I did a lot with philosophy, and particularly with not so much moral philosophy, but with the study of thinking processes and that
Hmm.
kind of thing, and then tried to put that together, those two disciplines together in the work that
Hmm.
I was doing myself,
Hmm.
and then also teaching it at the same time, and
Hmm.
the teaching process became very important, and the disciplines became important as teaching instruments, and so working with those ideas not merely for their own sake, but as tools that are useful and teaching others, and how working with other younger with young minds, and in learning from other minds, and that's a lot of my work is about that. It's about that process of learning
Hmm. Hmm.
as much as it is about the things that are learned. Um, and I've always been fascinated by that.
I should point out, since you're too modest to tell us, that you've received the Louis Brandeis Award for teaching, as also have been recognized as the Massachusetts Professor of the Year. So,
Yeah.
um,
No, I think mostly the students are my teachers. I
mm,
I was raised. One thing that greatly shaped me was the experience as an undergraduate in the Princeton system, in which precepts were very important. The precept was a small discussion group. The optimal size was about 6 students and,
mm,
and one teacher. It usually got a little larger than that, but and it was and it was mainly it was a precept was a place of conversation.
mhm,
It was not instruction in the usual way, but to people teaching each other.
mhm,
And I've always thought of teaching and learning as that kind of a shared process, in which all of us participated. So then I went on to do precepts in other forms, I think. But that precept model was always very important
mm,
in what I've tried to do, and
mm.
in the classroom,
Yes,
and in my books.
yeah,
Through,
yes. It does. They
same
do
thing.
come across as very. I don't want to say conversational, but it is as though we are sharing this
Yes,
experience with you.
it's very much of a sharing
Yes.
that way. It's the way I think about that process,
Hmm. Hmm.
and rather than pontificating, but it's a process of discourse,
Hmm.
um, and not lecturing, but exchanging ideas and learning in that process. I think
Yeah,
that's the
yes. Well, I think this in many ways has been a discourse, a conversation. I know the people who have been listening in are engaged, are happy to be engaged with you in this process, and I hope it will long continue. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this morning. Are there other things we should? I know we could go on for the rest of the day talking about philosophy, about your books, and about history, but I recognize your time has constraints. You're wanting to get to the book on Native Americans and other things.
Yes,
Other
I'm
things we can
happy to follow your lead.
okay.
Take the conversation wherever you want it to go.
Well, this has been fun. I wonder if you could just briefly think about how the different different Africans, African Americans you encountered in doing this book have changed your perception of American history.
Well, I think profoundly so, in that I think so much of American history has been written as an extension of European history. And I was astounded to see how first of all, how very rich and diverse the African uh, contributions have been. And most of my books are an effort to bring out that diversity, which
Mm-hmm.
I've tried to do very explicitly with different groups, different regions, different cultures, different African identities, then mixing and merging in different ways in American regions and so forth and so on. And I think that diversity became a source of creativity in many ways. And I wanted to celebrate that and then to get into the substance of it as
Mm-hmm.
well. I think it greatly broadened the meaning of American ideas, our ideas of liberty and freedom, our ideas of democracy and of a republic became more rich and larger as they engaged that diversity of cultures
Mm.
that is part of America. So
Interesting.
that's what I try to celebrate in my book,
Mm-hmm.
in my books
Right. Yes.
are mostly about the richness of that diversity and the creativity of it.
Right.
And all the better, the more as we can compound that diversity and extend it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people see difference as a threat. They see people who think differently as distant and in some ways dangerous. But I see it as quite the opposite. And I wanted to, and I think maybe that's partly coming of age. Maybe that's something that happens to people in a border state. It may be something that happens when they're living in periods of transformation,
Mm-hmm.
as my life has been for America. I mean, this is living through first of all as a child in the transformations of the period of the 1930s
Mm-hmm.
and early 40s, and then into the even more the more striking transformations that followed that in the 40s and 50s and 60s and on into our own time.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think
Interesting.
I've always delighted in that diversity and celebrate. All of my books
Mm.
are meant to be a celebration of diversity.
Interesting. Good. Now, as you know, we're involved with Revolution 250, with a consortium of folks who are interested in commemorating the revolution.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you would see as part of our mission for the 250th to, I don't want to say necessarily to bring these voices, people who might have been underrepresented into the fuller story, into
Yeah.
a national story, a patriotic story. How
Yes.
you see, if
Yeah.
you would see that as our mission, or if you would have something else that you might propose that we
Yes.
be
Well,
about.
I think that all of those, what happened in those periods was, which we first of all we as Americans demanded that our British rulers should pry open some areas in which our other ways than theirs could coexist and could flourish together, much to everybody's mutual gain.
Hmm.
And then that's where that process of diversity began to grow in some ways, and then the growth was compounded in each successive generation as more layers were added and so forth. And that's my understanding of the way American history works and how it has gained strength. And I think it gets stronger. It gets a little more confusing and distracting sometimes as these
Yes.
things get more diverse. But
Hmm.
I think that the strengths are much greater than the weaknesses in that process. And most of my book is very optimistic and bullish about the
Hmm.
prospects for America and for this process of continuing growth and continuing diversity. Far from seeing that as a threat, I
Hmm.
always see as reinforcing the great strengths of what this system is about. The more we confront differences, the better for us all.
Thank you. We've been talking to David Hackett Fischer, university professor and Warren Professor of History Emeritus at Brandeis University, and author of a number of books: Paul Revere's Ride, Washington's Crossing, Champlain's Dream, um, and his most recent one we've been talking about is African Founders: How Enslaved People Expanded American Ideals. And you know, David, when we started these podcasts about 2 years ago, we thought we'd have a handful of our friends in and around Boston listening in, but we actually have had an audience all over the world. We've had people listening in 70 different countries, 2,000 cities on every continent. So there really is an audience eager to hear these kinds
That's
of
wonderful
conversations.
that it's had
It
that
really is.
reach. That's great. Congratulations on that.
Well, I want to thank all the folks who listen in, and every week I acknowledge some of them. So we've had, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the names of some of these places, Brezloši, Slovenia, and Skellefteå, Sweden. We've had listeners in Sweden, Slovenia, Thailand,
Wow.
Germany, and as well in Edinburgh. We have regular listeners in Edinburgh, and also in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Colchester, Connecticut, Manchester, New Hampshire, and Dorchester, Massachusetts. So I want to thank everyone for listening. I really want to thank David for joining us today. David Hackett Fischer, his most recent book is African Founders. And I wish we could just keep on talking all day, but maybe we'll have you back and we can continue our conversation, and you can pick up any of Professor Fisher's books and continue this conversation with him. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, who will now have us piped off on the road to Boston. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Bob.